I think is one of the shifts that we've seen is in not trying to set the end goal for youth, but really, creating what we want to see is that youth are able to think of ideas, set goals for themselves, have the abilities, whether it's knowledge, skills, whether it's confidence, whatever it is, to actually execute them, but not have it so much based in terms of, well, have they got jobs? Have they, how many of them are staying in school? But really let them make those decisions, and are they sticking to the decisions that they made for themselves?
For conflict-affected areas, is there almost a hierarchy of needs that need to be addressed? And different programs should go in at different time, and we should coordinate our efforts so that, look, call us when you've got this done, and then we can come in and help, and we can help sustain something that someone else starts. Or we can help do advocacy to get a pilot project that seems promising up to scale.
Which youth do we target? And so, do we target the ex-combatants, but what about the do no harm that are rewarding violence? But then you have, you want to make sure that you're targeting your intervention to the people who are potentially creating the most risk. Or then where does that leave women? And so it's really challenging to figure out, where do you target where it's not rewarding bad behavior?
And who do we engage? I think there's a current debate of engaging young leaders, but there's this question of a false dichotomy of young people as violent and young people as peace builders, and there's all that youth in between that we don't engage as programmers. And so how do we move that to the future?
And then an issue of defining youth, and in terms of what that means for policies, for programming, for participation, for representation, and that perhaps defining based on age criteria is not a useful paradigm, but that instead considering issues of transition and the various transitions and the various overlaps and congruences of that is perhaps a more useful exercise.
I think that the debate about around definition will continue, where around conceptualizations of childhood, youth, and adulthood, and understanding those transitions. And I think particularly from a livelihoods perspective, when we're looking at child work versus child labor and issues like that are becoming increasingly common but contentious, I think that's a challenge that may continue.
We talked about it in our group. The length of time from youth, moving from being a youth into adulthood has lengthened. And livelihoods is part of that. There are other reasons for that. And that causes, young people sometimes now look for status by joining violent groups, as we've seen in Uganda. And so or they have more of a time where they have less direction in their lives, and other groups, negative forces sometimes will manipulate that time. And so that has been, in a sense, a turning point, that this length of time of adulthood is creates a risk.
Sort of going off this issue of conflict sensitivity, I think there's even more of a push now from conflict sensitivity and that sort of approach, the do no harm approach, to more of a focus on actual long-term peace building, which is a different thing, often conflated, but different. And then sort of extrapolating from that, I think it was mentioned over there, the development of the cluster system and the education cluster and things like that, sort of that humanitarian approach being solidified in this architecture at the global and country level. Similarly, the peace-building architecture being solidified at a global and a country level, the peace-building fund and support office and all of that.
I think a turning point would be the growth of youth culture and the way in which youth are able to participate through culture. I'm just thinking of people like Emmanuel Jal, who was a child soldier in, I think, Somalia, and then Ishmael Bear, who wrote a book, of course. And these are all ways in which, we haven't really mentioned any of these names, but these are ways in which, these have created turning points, not just through images, but also through stories. So I think the growth of narrative as a way for young people to participate in these debates is probably really important.
One of the formative moments changing our context was when the Erdahl article came out on the youth bulge colliding with 9/11 and a fear of young men as the driving force behind a lot of programming.
Did your jobs with regard to youth exist 30 years ago in your agencies, organisations, institutions and departments? And if so, then where do they come from and why? And our particular turning point on that would be 9/11, with regard to the idea that young people are a threat to maybe the West.
should we view youth in a much more narrow framework, which makes it easier to develop certain kinds of policies and develop funding streams and pay attention to programming? Or are we recognizing, rightly or wrongly, that there is a more holistic side to youth as actors in an environment and their development?
So coming from specifically an education perspective on this, but I think a growing recognition and action upon the idea that education can play a role, both positive or negative, in conflict. Then how does education for youth play a role in that issue of how education and education for youth and then youth play a role in conflict?
Can we have minimum standards for youth development programming? Would that be one step toward really building a more common dialogue, building the indicators and understanding of how to really deal with youth programming?
On the one hand, with children, we had the turning point of the Convention on the Rights of the Child providing a legal framework. And while we've turned to the present focusing on youth as a distinct group, we don't have a framework with which, a legal framework like that with which to engage.
There hasn't been a body that's really been pushing for youth and systematic attention to age in the programs and at the policy level, etc. I think there is really a growing awareness that it is necessary. Age is formally recognized as a cross-cutting issue in the so-called cluster approach. It means so far nothing in practice, but I think as more and more people like us are, and I'm thinking about the INEE Roundtable back in November and a number of other discussions, I think it is the moment to push for some interagency body to work at that high level IASC to make sure that there is systematic attention to the challenges young people face in emergency settings, including the very most acute settings.
It does seem in the last few years there's a renewed emphasis on youth as a distinct category as opposed to just children or adults. So it's an opportunity. The challenge is figuring out what to do with it. How do we really isolate, I mean, not from anything else, but if there is a lot more attention being paid to the category of youth, how do we take advantage of that? Because the pendulum swings. Like right now, youth, I think Gordon from the British Council said to me, youth is the new black. Well, in a few years, something else will be. Will we be able to sort of make gains in this period to sort of codify them so that when something else is the trendy thing that everyone's looking at, will we have managed to accomplish some things while there's a lot of it, and people willing, even in this recessed economy, global recession, people seem to be willing to pay more attention to the problem of youth.